So today in part one, obviously, I'm trying to do an introduction. I want to take us through a very brief exercise, and then I want to talk a little bit about the European fairy tale, even though this class is specifically about race and how ideas about race influence the genre of the fairy tale. I think it's helpful to understand some of the ways that people have thought about the fairy tale and what it means. And then we'll look at some actual illustrations of whiteness and race in the European fairy tale as kind of a preview of what I'm hoping we're going to do in this class. So let's see. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk about Jean-Baptiste Bassile's very early 17th century collection called The Tale of Tales. And I'll go into a lot more of that in the second half. But first, let's just start with an exercise. I'd like you all to close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself in a fairy tale world. Just picture yourself in that world. Look around you. What do you see? Notice the setting, the characters, any features of that world. Okay? You feel like you've done that? You've probably seen as images of fairy tales. That's probably pretty easy. What are some of the things that you saw in that world? Yes. The forest. The forest. Okay, great. Yes. Dragon. Okay. What else? Castle. Castle. Old women. Old women.
I was the third son who wasn't thought to be promising.
Okay, the third son. Smiling animals, smiling bears. Okay, good. Yes. Big bad wolf. What else, Doug?
Everybody's white.
Thank you. Okay. Wow. Okay. Not fair. That was kind of my next question. As you look around, did you notice anyone who wasn't white? Right? Probably not. Doug noticed very clearly that everyone was white. Right? And even just all the things that you just named, when we picture the fairy tale world, it is a white world. And it's not a white world by accident. And I say that, I don't mean that because the fairy tale emerged, around the late 16th, early 17th century in Europe, and I am talking about the European fairy tale. I'm not suggesting that like Europe was predominantly or only white at that time, and that's why we have a white world. But really, more, I'm trying to suggest that ideas about race existed, even though we didn't call it race until the 18th century. But in the 16th and 17th century, ideas about race and racial difference, racisms, all of those things contributed in a critical way to the very development of the fairy tale. That's the kind of argument that I want to lay out over the course of our class and have us think about together. And that's what I mean when I say that the fairy tale world is not white by accident or by happenstance. They're very intentional ideas that influence the writers who created the sort of canonical collections that we have today. And that's why I think we have a very white fairy tale world. So, like I mentioned before, we really dive into that material and look at some illustrations and some images, I just want to talk a little bit about what the fairy tale is. I think it would be helpful for us to have some kind of shared working knowledge. The problem is that fairy tales are a lot like pornography, right? Like, I know that probably sounds strange to you because we think of one as a children's genre and one as an adult genre, but what I mean is that fairy tales are like pornography insofar as we all think we know what they are, and yet it's virtually impossible to define them, right? Some of you may remember that in 1964, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart could not say what constituted obscenity or pornography. He just said, I know it when I see it. And I think in many ways, the fairy tale is the same way. And I should say there are also, by the way, there is a lot of pornography that has fairy tale themes, but that's not what I'm talking about, the ways that they are similar. So, so we have this thing that feels very familiar to us, something that we think we understand, and yet no one has yet come up with a really good working definition of what the fairy tale is. But I think I'm pulling from some different ideas just so that we have a loose sense of what we're talking about. So fairy tale scholars and many other people have spent a great deal of time and energy trying to define the fairy tale, or trying to define the genre. So I want to share some of their perspectives here. In general, the ways that they've tried to define the genre fall into three categories, sort of by the thematic dimensions of the genre, by its function, and by its structure. And I just really want to talk a little bit about the thematic today. And this isn't a class like Introduction to the Fairy Tale, which I teach at UCSC, and I go much deeper. If you're interested, though, in learning more about how people have tried to define the fairy tale by its function or by its structure, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you, and you're welcome to email me at any time. But thematically, people have really tried to think about magic and metamorphosis as key components. And then some people add in also the quest narrative as part of the definition. So for instance, two of our very most famous kind of popular fairy tale scholars, Marina Warner, whom you might have heard about. She wrote a book called From Beast to the, well, she wrote many, many books, but one of them is called From the Beast to the Blonde. And Jack Zipes, who has written about 1,000 fairy tale books, many of which say the same thing, in my opinion. but they both refer to magical transformation as the defining quality of the fairy tale. So Marina Warner identifies, quote, shape-shifting and metamorphosis as foundational motifs in fairy tales. And Jack Zipes argues that it is, quote, the sense of wondrous change that distinguishes the literary fairy tale from the moral story. So here, Marina Warner and Jack Zipes are pretty specific in suggesting magical or wondrous metamorphosis as one of the fairy tale's defining themes. But others argue that magic itself is the fairy tale's defining feature. And many of you identified that as part of the things that you saw when I asked you to visualize the fairy tale world. So as you know, as a magical realm, the fairy tale brings humans together with other magical creatures, witches and dragons, fairies and ogres, dwarves and devils, but also magical objects, talking animals, and other kinds of enchanted beings. And all of this magic happens in a world where it's totally normalized, right? Like nobody in the fairy tale world is saying, oh my God, that's a talking animal. Like we would probably say that, but they're not saying that. It's just the magic is part of the natural world. And so it's totally unremarkable. And yet it's often critical to the resolution of the story, right? It's critical in moving the plot along. Without magic, the hero or heroine probably would not be able to prevail over evil and win, i.e. marry the heterosexual prize. And it is very heterosexual, the traditional fairy tale genre. And people have done good work on rereading queerness into the traditional fairy tale. And if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer those as well. So like I mentioned at the outset, in addition to magic and metamorphosis, others have really centered the quest narrative coupled with magic as constitutive of the fairy tale as a genre. And obviously, as the name implies, a quest narrative is a story about a quest or a mission or a journey of some sort to resolve whatever problem or crisis or lack that the hero or heroine has. And the success of the quest and the resolution of the crisis at hand often depends on magic to facilitate a kind of metamorphosis. And that metamorphosis could be literal, like a disenchantment, right? Going from being a beast or a frog or asleep to becoming human again or awake. Or it could be figurative, like a rise in social status or a marriage, or in many cases, both a rise in social status and a marriage. Of course, the quest is challenging. It involves dangers and evil forces that are intent on thwarting the hero or heroine's efforts. And again, that's why they often require the assistance of magical helpers, objects, animals. So thematically, some would argue that the fairy tale could be defined not just by magic, but more specifically by the way that the magic facilitates the hero's journey or quest, and that results in some kind of wondrous transformation. And not surprisingly, as you all already know, in most fairy tales, the quest narrative is also intertwined with a romance narrative, right? That's, sort of what I said about the winning the heterosexual prize. The successful completion of one usually leads to the resolution of the other. And this is probably not at all an unfamiliar idea to you, because in our cultural language, we use fairy tale to mean romance, right? Like for us, fairy tale is all about a romance in our everyday parlance. We have magic, we have metamorphosis, we have quest, we have romance, but we see those in a lot of other genres as well. So one final feature that scholars have identified as perhaps being definitive or constitutive of a fairy tale is its own particular brand of temporality. That is, fairy tale time is distinct. Of course, as you know, it begins with once upon a time, which is a formulaic opening that pushes us into some kind of time that is outside of historical time, right? It's different from mythological time, which is often the very beginning of time, right? Myths often tell us about the creation of the world or the beginning of time. And it's different from legendary time, which is historical time, even though it could be way far back. That is to say, when we talk about legends, we generally talk about things that people could believe, right? Like we might have a legend about a rock formation and how it got that way. It's set in a real time. But fairy tale time, even though when you imagined it, you probably saw some early modern or medieval architecture or things like that, but really it's its own time. And it's also it also operates with a form of temporality that's freed from our regular laws, right? It's freed from the laws of real life and real time. So in fairy tale time, a princess might sleep for 100 years and wake up without having aged a day, right? Or a prince might be cursed to live as a beast or a frog for centuries before a beautiful virgin comes and disenchants him. So this is a kind of temporality that's fantastic and unusual and pretty unique to fairy tales, unless we're talking about another kind of fantasy genre where this kind of play with time is itself one of the themes. But here again, as with the magic of the fairy tale world, it's unremarkable, right? It's just built into the world, this fantastic temporality. So for our purposes, I would like us just to kind of think about the fairy tale as something that brings together magic, metamorphosis, wondrous transformation through some kind of quest, problem, a problem that has to be resolved, and that exists with this fantastic temporality, none of which is special within the world of the fairy tale at all. So I just need to do a little math, and we started at 10:30, so I go to 10 after for the first part. Okay. So as an aside, I also just want to note that because all of this is so normalized in the fairy tale world, when we read fairy tales, we often come across things that just seem weird to us, right? I'm sure you can think of some fairy tales where you're like, why was that girl asked to go pick strawberries in the snow, right? Like there's just these weird things. There's these odd tasks and odd elements, and they're totally unremarkable within the context of the fairy tale world. But I think one of the things that I want us to think about, and that I hope I'll be able to show to you over the course of our 4 weeks together, is that maybe some of these things, some of these oddities, aren't just oddities of the fairy tale world, but can be explained by some of the racial thinking and racial logics of the particular time periods and cultures in which those tales were penned, because the tales that we're looking at are really literary tales. And so I think we have to hold on to the fact that we have these strange worlds where sometimes things just don't make sense, and sometimes those things that don't make sense in this genre might actually make sense if we have the right context for understanding them. So that's our goal here. Okay. So again, like I said, let's return to that world of the European fairy tale that I asked you to imagine at the beginning of class, and that Doug so astutely pointed out is completely white. Over the course of our time together, I'm going to talk about 4 different canonical collections or series, some of which you're probably familiar with. We're going to start with Jean-Baptiste Basile's The Tale of Tales, which was published, I'll talk about this after the break, but published in the early 17th century. Then we're going to talk about some collections in France, beginning in the late 17th century with collections by Madame d'Aulnoy, and then in the middle of the 18th century, some Beauty and the Beast stories, including the ones that we're most familiar with today. Then from there, we're going to go to the early 19th century and talk about the Grimm's collection. And then from there, we'll move to the late 19th and early 20th century and talk about Andrew Lang's colored fairy book series. And some of you may have grown up with these. My mother grew up with these. It was like the red fairy book, the blue fairy book, the yellow fairy book. There are a dozen of them. And I want us to think about the whole series and what kind of work the series itself is doing. And in the one of the fascinating for me things about these collections is that they also form a genealogy of the European fairy tale. They really build on each other, and I'll try to draw that out over the course of our lectures. And we can really see these lines of literary influence. And so the part of the argument that I'm going to try to sell to you is that as we see race and ideas about race and racial thinking in very particular forms, in very particular historical, cultural contexts, underpinning some of the fairy tales that are emerging in those moments, they also are getting carried forward to the next collections, the next step in the genealogy, but they get reworked for that particular cultural, historical moment. And that's what I hope that I'll be able to unpack for you. And all of this is happening over the course of about 300 years. And then I'm hoping, not hoping, I am going to end with some contemporary responses to the whiteness of the fairy tale world. And hopefully, I feel like that's kind of a nice way to end this kind of project. I also want to say I'm less interested, and I want us to be less interested in the ways that the European fairy tale is quote unquote racist, or promotes racist stereotypes or anti-Semitic stereotypes or feminist or anti-feminist stereotypes. All of that is true, but I don't want us to be like overly fixated on, okay, this is racist. These were produced from the early 17th century to the early 20th century. And that's not to excuse racism. Certainly there were people during those time periods who were challenging ideas, racist ideas. But I'm much more interested, and I want us to be interested in how racial thinking, that is ideas about race and otherness, actually structured the genre of the fairy tale in a way that has made it very, very white, when in fact, I don't think it is at all. Okay, so it's just a little distinction, but one that I feel strongly about. Okay, so as a sort of preview and kind of shortcut, I want to turn to some examples from visual culture that I think will help us see very literally the ways that race and racist beliefs were simultaneously naturalized, that is, made invisible in a lot of ways, and at the same time were made essential to the fairy tale and to its meaning. So the first example that I want to talk about comes from two illustrations for an Hungarian fairy tale called The Glass Axe that was published in Andrew Lang's 1894 Yellow Fairy book. And one of the things to know about Lang's colored fairy books, which I'll talk about toward the end of the class, is that he and his wife Nora highly edited them. So they rewrote them specifically, as they said, for the taste of white people or the taste for children. So the version that you're getting is from Lang, and it was illustrated as the colored fairy books were. So I need to summarize the story, and I'm going to be telling more stories today than I will ordinarily, just because I haven't asked you to read anything yet. So very quickly, The Glass Axe recounts a story of a prince who's been cursed, and he has to live without his feet ever touching the ground. And there will be a terrible fate should his feet ever touch the ground. And of course, because he's a prince, all precautions imaginable have been taken so that his feet will never touch the ground, except that he goes out hunting and is thrown from his horse. And of course, his feet touch the ground, and he awakens in a strange land that he's never seen before. And it happens to be ruled by a fairy who is an evil fairy. So that's the other thing we need to know, that fairies are not always benevolent beings as we often think of them from fairy godmothers. But this fairy gives him a glass axe and tells him he has to clear the entire forest by sunset with this glass axe. The fairy also cautions, okay, this quote from Lang, cautions him with many angry words against speaking to a black girl he would most likely meet in the wood. Okay, that's weird. So he goes to do this task, and not surprisingly, the glass axe shatters upon striking the first tree. And so the prince doesn't know what to do. He just starts wandering around the forest. He's in complete despair, and he wanders around until he exhausts himself and he falls asleep. And when he awakens, lo and behold, there's a black girl who explains that she too is under the fairy's curse. And not only that, this evil fairy is her mother. Okay? I told you, these things they're just weird. Fairy tales are weird. And also, of course, if he lets on that he knows that the fairy is the black girl's mother, the girl will die. Okay? So the black girl, she's called the black girl throughout. The black girl tells him that she can help him accomplish all the tasks that this evil fairy is setting for him, and that he can eventually free her, the black girl, from her curse by taking her away from this land. So the prince goes and he accomplishes all of these impossible tasks that the fairy is setting for him. And the fairy, of course, is completely shocked that he's able to do this. And so she goes and she spies on him to see how he is in fact doing it. And then she learns that her daughter has been helping him. And at that point, she lets out this ferocious shriek and she starts chasing them. The girl uses magic, of course, to transform the two of them into various kinds of objects. And this is a familiar escape motif or trope in fairy tales. She makes them into different objects and thereby facilitates their escape. And after a series of very frightening encounters with the increasingly enraged fairy, the prince disenchants the black girl, who becomes, quote, the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. and together they drown the fairy before they get married and live happily ever after. Okay, so the very formulaic story. So Henry J. Ford's illustrations for the glass acts depict two key scenes. The first here is captioned, "The black girl stops the witch with a bit of rock." And I hope you can see it features a dark-skinned girl in kind of a loose tunic and harem-style pants. And the white prince is off to the right of the image in royal European hunting garb. Remember, he was out hunting when he was thrown from his horse. The second slide is captioned, the second illustration is captioned with a line from the story. "But the waters seized the fairy's chariot and sunk it in the lowest depths." And here in the backdrop, we see the drowning fairy and her doomed dragon. And in the foreground, we see the prince and a young white woman who is now in royal European clothing as they swim away from the dark scene of destruction, right? So Sarah Hines, a scholar who's published on these illustrations, notes that in the Yellow Fairy book, the second illustration is not placed with the text that describes the scene, right? It's not placed under the part of the text talking about the drowning of the chariot and their escape. Rather, it's positioned such that it, quote, "immediately follows the line in the text that indicates the girl has become beautiful." Okay, so Sarah Hines argues that this, what she calls out of sequence placement, she argues that the out of sequence placement is meaningful in its own right beyond just the images. And she writes, "The illustration capitalizes on an implication that is latent in the text. Although there is no direct suggestion in the text that the girl changes skin color, these Victorian illustrations, strategically placed in the story, interpret the text for us, and they support the assumption that contemporary readers would have understood the girl to have been transformed from a Black woman to a white woman," right? That's what makes her beautiful in the logic of the period. I think that Hines's careful analysis of the placement of the two illustrations is fabulous. It's super convincing. But I would also argue that they need not be positioned in that out of sequence manner in order to expose the ideologies of race and beauty underpinning the tale, right? It's not only the positioning that makes that apparent, it's the very illustrations themselves. So this idea, the assumption that Blackness is an accursed state in the European fairy tale, is something that we'll see over and over in this class, as is its corollary that disenchantment involves becoming white and often specifically called beautiful, right? So this is a really, to me, emblematic set of illustrations that help us visualize exactly what it is I'm hoping to do in this class. The second example that I want to share before we break is just more of a survey that demonstrates, I think, how ideas about race, that is, these racial logics, aren't set in stone, right? That they change over time, they change according to the cultural moment, and that's important for us, right? They're all working with racial logics, but those racial logics differ from case to case. So the images I'm going to show now all illustrate versions of Beauty and the Beast from the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Some of them are illustrations from books, and some of them are ads or posters for pantomimes, which are basically staged productions of fairy tales. And I think what we'll see in this quick survey is the way the beast's otherness is sometimes highly racialized and sometimes highly speciesized, if that's a word, right? Sometimes the beast as another species is what really comes to the ground. Sometimes the beast as a human who's raced, it comes to the ground. And of course, it will be no surprise to you that the intersection of animality and race is prevalent here as well, and that we see this over and over in the fairy tales too. Even though these images that I'm going to show come from the Victorian and the Edwardian periods, this logic about the beast as a racialized figure begin at least in the middle of the 18th century for Beauty and the Beast. I'm going to make an argument next week that they might even occur sooner for us, earlier historically. But in the version of Beauty and the Beast by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont, which is the most common version of the story, the one that you probably all are familiar with, and which is the basis for the Disney version of the movie, that story is set it's part of a magazine for young girls, and it has a frame to all the stories in it. And the frame is that there's a governess instructing her young pupils. And so they discuss the various stories that she's sharing, and they're supposed to take morals from them. So around Beauty and the Beast, Miss Molly, one of the pupils listening to the story, just specifically compares the beast to her father's lackey, a quote, little boy who was all black. So even in the inception of the version of the story that we're most familiar with, already there's a very articulated, explicit connection between the beast and racial difference. Okay, let's go through these very quickly and then have a break. So from 1890, you can see the beast is this sort of monkey-like figure, but also wearing clothing that would probably resonate with images of Africa at the time. So again, racialized. This is for the same production, but a different ad. And again, you can see in the clothing, the racialization of difference. Walter Crane, a very popular illustrator of fairy tales. Here, this is not the beast so much as the beast's court, but again, the animality of the creatures. Here we see much more of a species kind of difference, right, in the beast. But here, a very humanized, racialized kind of beast. And here too, I think similarly, a humanesque, but perhaps racialized, perhaps species. We really get to see the intersection there. And same here too. So just to take us through this quick visual survey, so we have a kind of sense of, one, why it is that when you visualize the fairy tale world at the start of class, like I asked you to, you saw particular kinds of images, right? And then to see how those are working with specific tales. And that's what we're going to really unpack in the rest of the class. Okay, let's take a break, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Thank you. Barry is so helpful. He's better than any TA I've ever had. It's really great. Don't tell them I said that. I'll get in a lot of trouble these days. Oh, okay. So, like I said, in the second half of class today, I'm really gonna end up kind of telling more stories than I will for the rest of the class, partly because I didn't ask you to read anything, and it's we sort of need to understand these stories in order to understand my lecture next Monday that is unpacking these. But first, I want to talk a little bit about this collection by Jean-Baptiste Basile called The Tale of Tales. It's also subtitled Entertainment for the Little One, which is tongue-in-cheek, as I think you'll see. So as I mentioned, The Tale of Tales is generally considered the first collection of European fairy tales. That's not to say that there weren't published literary fairy tales in Europe prior to this time. Certainly there were in the 16th century, but this is the first collection specifically of fairy tales, and that's pretty widely agreed upon. And so I think this is a good place to start our sort of genealogy and our journey, because this collection, in addition to being sort of the first collection of European fairy tales, was also very influential in the collections that came after. And in the 17th century, people weren't as sensitive to what we would call plagiarism as we are today. And so we can really see the lines of literary influence from Basile on. And it's very important that way because race is really factoring in a major way in this collection. But I think in order to understand some of the key elements or some of the key features of the Tale of Tales, we have to understand just a little bit about Basile himself. So I'm going to do a short biography or just some short biographical highlights. And then I'll share some of the language because I think it might be surprising to you and how if you think of fairy tales in the way that I think most of us do in our culture. Okay, so let's see. Basile was born in a small village called Posillipo, which is just outside of Naples. And it's important to remember that at this period, Naples was part of the Spanish Empire, right? His family was, in the words of one of his biographers, respectable, but not quite well-to-do. And all of the children in the family, and he had at least 6 siblings, spent their professional lives in service to different courts throughout Italy and abroad. And I'm just going to refer to what is today Italy as Italy, even though obviously in this time period it wasn't Italy. Basile led a pretty itinerant life, often having to go from court to court. He was a writer. He also served for a little bit in sort of as a soldier. And so he spent time in the Mediterranean, which at that time was incredibly diverse, right? It was bringing together parts of Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, and of course, the Spanish Empire. So it's a very diverse area that he was in. So although, or maybe perhaps because Basile led such an itinerant life, he was very attached to Naples, and he wrote about Naples a lot in his work. He really celebrated Naples. And in fact, he, toward the end of his career, started writing in the Neapolitan vernacular. And this would have been very unusual at the time for someone who was basically sort of an intellectual in service to the courts, right? So one of the Neapolitan works that he wrote was this collection, The Tale of Tales. And it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was published posthumously between 1634 and 1636. It's also sometimes called the Pentamerone because it takes place over 5 days. So it's a storytelling occasion that takes place over 5 days, and there are 10 stories told every day by these 10 different women who have these outrageous names like Flatfoot or Ugly One Eye or just crazy names. And so one of the things that we learned from Basile's description is during the time period, there was a certain impression of who were the best storytellers. And they were old women in the areas, usually of lower classes, which is why they had these crazy, insulting names. That was just an aside. So even though the Tale of Tales never achieved any kind of real status in Basile's, not his lifetime, but in the 17th century, since it was published posthumously, obviously not in his lifetime, but it never really was respected in the way that some of his other writings are. And yet today it is the writing for which he is known. And in fact, most people couldn't name any other thing that he's written, and no one would really probably read very much else of what he's written. And I've tried, it's pretty bad, in my opinion. So So as I said, not only is this the collection for which Basile is most well known, it's also widely considered the first collection of European fairy tales. And the audience, sure.
So were these oral?
They are playing with oral tales, right? But they are not transcriptions or even attempts to write an oral tale, right? So
Oral tales of the origin of the stories, and then he literally.
or some of these tales were definitely circulating in oral tradition. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but I think it's very hard to sort of historicize orality and literacy in relation to fairy tales or folk tales and fairy tales, because what we know is that certainly tales were circulating orally, and then sometimes people wrote about them, but sometimes people read tales and then started telling them orally, and then sometimes people would collect them thinking that they were purely oral sources, and then they would get written up like in the Grimms as if they were oral sources, right? So the sort of distinction between oral and literary is a complex one. In this time period, certainly, and I think we know this from other published versions of tales, many of these tales adhere to tale types that did exist in oral tradition. But Basile was really playing with that, and that becomes very critical to his project. So most likely the audience for the Tale of Tales would have been members of the provincial courts in and around Naples. And basically, they would have been read aloud as after dinner entertainment, right? And again, the collection is titled Entertainment for the Little One, and that is very tongue-in-cheek. And I just mentioned this because, well, it's tongue-in-cheek, first of all, because these tales are incredibly bawdy, sexual, vulgar, especially when compared to what we imagine to be the fairy tale, which we think of as for children, innocent, and educational, right? So definitely Basile was playing around with that. And I just want to share a quick example. Well, it's not that quick. I want to share some language from the frame tale, because I think that will really give you a good sense of the flavor. But first, I need to tell you a little bit about the frame tale. The frame tale, so again, this is a 5-day storytelling event with 10 storytellers, each of whom tells a tale on each of those days. So we have 50 tales. This all gets put into place by the frame tale, which centers on a princess named Zosa, who's super grouchy pants and she never laughs, okay? And her father, the king, is of course beside himself about this. So he does everything he can think of to try to make her laugh. He hires all these entertainers and brings in these different people and just anything he can think of. And she just still will not laugh. She's total sourpuss. So he tries all of these different things and he's completely desperate. So he thinks, okay, I'm going to install a fountain of oil and just hope that something funny happens and she'll laugh. And so that's what he does. And so this is where we come in. The fountain was thus constructed, and one day, and by the way, you're allowed to laugh. And one day while Zosa was sitting at the window, as sourly as a pickle, an old woman chanced to pass by. She began to fill a jar she had brought with her, sopping up the oil with a sponge. And as she was busily going about her task, a certain devil of a court page threw a stone at her with such precision that it hit the jar and broke to pieces. At that, the old woman, who had no hairs on her tongue and let no one ride on her back, turned to the page and began to say, "Ah, you worthless thing, you dope, shithead, bed pisser, leaping goat, diaper ass, hangman's noose, bastard mule. Just look, even fleas can cough now. Go on, may paralysis seize you. May your mother get bad news. May you not live to see the 1st of May. Go on, may you be thrust by a Catalan lance or torn apart by ropes. so that no blood will be wasted. May you suffer 1,000 ills and then some with wind in your sails. May your seed be lost. Scoundrel, beggar, son of a taxed woman. And here prostitutes were taxed at the time. Rogue. After hearing this juicy outburst, the lad, who had little hair on his chin and even less discretion, repaid her in the same coin, saying, "Why don't you shut that sewer hole, you boogeyman's grandmother? Blood-sucking witch, baby down," I think that should be drowner, rag shitter, fart gatherer. When this news hit home, the old woman became so angry that, losing her phonetic compass bearings and charging from the stable of patients, she raised her stage curtain and revealed a woodsy scene. And at this spectacle, Zosa started laughing so hard that she nearly lost her senses. Okay, so here you have a little bit of the language. Like I said, you can laugh at this. This is funny. It's bawdy. It's vulgar. So while children, were not necessarily excluded from audiences, they certainly were not the intended audience for this collection. There may have been at the time some tales told specifically for and to children, but these are not the tales that are in Basile's collection, as you can probably see. And these were really intended for elite literary circles, adults in those elite literary circles, which might seem a little strange given this kind of language. So what's fascinating about this, I think, is that Basile also, remember, writing in the vernacular, right? Writing in vernacular Neapolitan, often using these kinds of crude languages and themes, and then subtitling the collection, Entertainment for the Little One, is really drawing out the paradoxes and tensions inherent in this combination of what at the time was a high literary art, right? A written volume with the low language, the quote unquote low language of the people, right? And this was really this kind of combination of high and low arts was experimental at the time, and it was what is often described as Baroque. And I know we often think of the Baroque as something that's like really detailed and fancy and labyrinthine in design, but in this moment, Baroque writers were really just searching for new, innovative, experimental ways to bring pleasure through their texts. And Basile experimented with, again, this kind of low genre in a high art form. So this was very, very unusual at the time. In addition, at the same time, the society was pretty oppressive. Governments were very conservative, and they really limited, there was very limited religious and political freedom. So for Basile, these kinds of Baroque artistic practices, especially again, the invention of the literary fairy tale as a way to introduce a new form by mixing high and low, provided also an indirect way to critique these dominant structures in society, right? So the Tale of Tales was from its inception kind of subversive. It was an inherently political project, especially in the way that it represents kings and other aristocrats using the language of the common people, talking about things that were not befitting of the aristocracy, of royalty, and also doing really stupid things. So if you read this collection in its entirety, the kings and queens and princes are often given like names that suggest how dumb they are, but they're also seen doing these actions that are just folly. So this, again, is a sort of collection of grotesque deformations or caricatures of official political and official royal language and culture. So in that way, it's also really significant, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. Okay, let's return to the frame tale. You'll recall that we left Zosa laughing finally when the old woman lifts her stage curtain and reveals a woodsy scene. I just think that's such a great line. So not surprisingly, the old crone gets irate when Zosa starts laughing at her, and she curses her. Her curse is that Zosa will only ever be able to marry this one person, the Prince of Roundfield, who happens to be himself cursed to a deep sleep until a maiden comes along and fills a jug that's hanging there next to his coffin where he's sleeping with her tears. Okay, so Zosa sets out on this quest, and along the way she meets 3 fairies. I think someone even mentioned that everything in the world you visualize happens in threes, and Mark mentioned the youngest son. So she goes out, she meets 3 fairies, and each one gives her a magical nut and says, only open this magical nut in your moment of utmost need. So she says, okay, she takes her little nuts with her. She finally finds the prince, and she sees the jug hanging there, and she starts crying. She starts telling her story. Not really that sad yet, I don't think, but it's so terrible. So she's crying, and the jug is filling up. And within 2 days, it's really close to being filled, like really close. But for any of you who've ever cried a bunch, you know it's exhausting to cry. So she's been crying straight for 2 days, and she's exhausted, and she decides she's just going to take a little rest. So I'm going to read the next scene because in the same way that I wanted you to get a sense of how bawdy and kind of vulgar Basile's collection is, I also want you to get a sense of the kind of racist thinking that informs this whole story and collection. Okay. So remember, Zosa's napping. She's filled up most of the jug. In the meantime, there arrived a certain crooked-legged slave girl who often went to the fountain to fill her urn and who knew about the epitaph business since talk of it was everywhere. When she saw Zosa crying so hard to make those 2 trickles of tears, she sat for a long time and spied on her, waiting until the pitcher was almost full so that she could wrench that fine booty from Zosa's hands and leave her with a fistful of flies. As soon as she saw that Zosa was asleep, she took advantage of the opportunity and skillfully slipped the pitcher out from under her, placed her own eyes above it, and in 4 snaps filled it. The moment it was full to the brim, the prince got out of his coffin of white stone as if he were awakening from a long sleep, took hold of that mass of black flesh, and carried her off to his palace, where, amid festivities and royal fireworks, he made her his wife. But when Zosa awoke and found the pitcher overturned, and with it her hopes, and saw the coffin open, her heart squeezed shut so tightly that she nearly unpacked the parcels of her soul at the custom house of death. Finally, realizing that there was no remedy for her ills and that all she had to complain about were her own eyes, which had insufficiently guarded the calf of her hopes, she set off 1 foot after another until she arrived at the city. There she heard of the prince's festivities and of the fine sort of wife he had taken, and at once imagined what must have happened, exclaiming with a sigh that 2 black things had brought her to her downfall, sleep and a slave. So not surprisingly, the slave girl who often who goes unnamed in this part of the story, and who's often called the slave princess or still the slave girl, not surprisingly, given the logics of the time, turns out to be like a really awful, domineering, nasty wife. She quickly gets pregnant, and Zosa, in the meantime, has bought a house or maybe a palace right across from their palace, and is often at the window. And of course, Tadeo, that's the prince's name, sees her and falls immediately in love with her. And the slave wife can kind of figure this out, but you know, but that's not that much of a driving plot point. It's just an aside. So Zosa thinks, this seems like a good time to start opening my magical nuts because I'm in dire need of some help. So she opens one of the nuts on the windowsill, and out pops like a little tiny man who starts singing, and he sings more beautifully than the king of birds. And the slave wife sees this and she wants it, like she has to have it. And remember, she's pregnant now. And so she says to her husband, go get that for me or I'm going to kill the baby, right? And she says it in a what would be called a Moorish patois. So she says something like, if you know, get me that little Georgie kill, or something like that, right? So it's also, there's very specific use of a language that's very different from language we see anywhere else in the story. So this happens 2 more times. The prince goes over there and Zosa just says, oh, sure, you can have this little singing man, nothing in return, okay? And then it happens a second time. I think the second time it's like a little golden hen with these teeny tiny chicks, and they're playing on the windowsill, and the wife says the same thing, like, go get that for me, I'm going to kill the baby. And the third time, there's like a little doll, a live doll, like a little person, and Tadeo comes to get it, and Zosa whispers in the doll's ear to inspire in the wife an unquenchable desire to hear stories, okay? So that is what prompts the whole rest of the collection, the 5 days. And so let's just hold that aside. We will get to the end of the frame tale, but this then, now the wife says, go get people to tell me stories, I'm gonna kill the baby if you don't do it, right? This is always the threat, and Tadeo is motivated by that threat. So the stories begin. And I just want to share quickly 3 other stories that I think are really critical. 2 are versions of Cupid and Psyche, which, as you may know, is also related to Beauty and the Beast. And one is called The 3 Citrons, which kind of parallels the frame story. But so the 2 Cupid and Psyche stories are called, one's called The Padlock, and one is called The Golden Trunk. And so in The Padlock, Luciella, the youngest daughter of a poor woman, goes to fetch water at a fountain, and there she encounters a quote-unquote handsome slave. And he asks her, will you come to this grotto with me? I promise to give you a lot of nice things if you do. And again, this is a fairy tale. So she goes, okay, that sounds great. And she goes off with him to this magnificent underground palace where she lives in luxury. And she has a nocturnal lover whom she never sees, right? Remember, this is like Cupid and Psyche. But there's a certain point she wants to go visit her mother. And so the handsome slave says, okay, you can do that. He gives her a bunch of money, and he dresses her really nicely, but he says, but you have to come back soon, and you have to promise that you won't reveal where you're staying. So she makes multiple visits home, and as in Cupid and Psyche, her sisters are jealous, and they convince her to try to identify the husband, the nocturnal lover. And they say, like, you're never going to be happy unless you know his identity. And so they also give her a padlock, like a padlock, and she's supposed to use that to lock him to her, right, to secure him to her. So she returns, and she opens the padlock to secure him, and okay, there's a fairy tale. All these like voices start screaming, and it wakes him up, and lo and behold, he's white and beautiful, right, at night. And but now he's been awoken, and she's gone against his wishes, so he banishes her, and she has to travel around the world on her own, and she's pregnant. And through her travels, she meets this lady in waiting to a queen who feels sorry for her and takes her into the palace. And Luciella gives birth there, and there's this beautiful baby. And every night, this handsome stranger comes into the room and speaks sweet nothings to the baby. And the lady in waiting is sort of like, what's going on? This seems kind of weird. So even though it's a fairy tale, she thinks this is odd. And he always leaves right before the rooster's first crow. And so this happens several nights in a row, and the lady in waiting goes to the queen and tells her this, and the queen is like, okay, I got to check this out. So she, first of all, though, has all the roosters killed so that the handsome stranger won't leave, and she goes and hides in the room, and quelle surprise, the handsome stranger turns out to be the queen's son, who was cursed to be a handsome black slave, who is cursed to be black until his mother embraces him and until the roosters no longer crow. Okay, so then he's reconciled with Lucilla and they get married. Okay. Yeah, it's weird, right? Okay. The second one is called The Golden Trunk. And in this story, again, it's another version of the same story. Parmetella is the youngest daughter of a poor family, and she takes their sow to graze in a field, and there she finds a tree with golden leaves. And every day she takes home one of these leaves and her father can sell it, and that's helping to sustain their family economically. But, before long, she's taken all the leaves, and so she decides that she's going to cut down the golden trunk of the tree. So she goes, but what she finds is that beneath the golden trunk, there's a staircase, and she follows it. And when she goes underground, following the staircase under the golden trunk, she finds an amazing, beautiful palace. And there she meets a handsome slave who says he wants her for a wife and will make her the happiest woman in the world. So every night, the handsome slave instructs her to put out the candle and not look at them while they have sex. And this keeps happening. But one night after the handsome slave falls asleep, of course, she lights the candle. Remember, there's a Cupid and Psyche story. She lights the candle and sees also, lo and behold, he is white. But in lighting the candle, she awakens him, and he is super pissed off because now it means that his curse is extended for another 7 years, and he banishes her, and then he just disappears. So she's out, looking for him. She's traveling the world, and she runs into a fairy who helps her survive and tells her, you need to go to the house of this ogress, who happens to be the mother of the handsome slave. And it turns out his name is Thunder and Lightning. And the ogress tries to eat Parmetella, but the fairy has told her how to avoid being eaten. And so instead, the ogress mother assigns her a bunch of impossible seeming tasks, again, like Cupid and Psyche. So she has to sort 12 huge bags of beans into type in one day. She has to fill these huge mattresses with bird feathers, exactly the kinds of impossible things that you can imagine. She also has to go get on the final day these magical instruments from the ogress's sister, who's also another ogress. So she just starts crying, understandably. And Thunder and Lightning hears her, and even though he's so mad at her, he must also kind of be in love with her, because he comes and he gives her advice and tells her how to survive the tasks, and she does all that. And the ogress mother is really upset because she just wants to, kill Parmetella. And so she arranges a marriage for her son, for Thunder and Lightning. But because he's in love with Parmetella, he kills the other bride and takes Parmetella to bed. And in the morning, the ogress finds them, and she's beside herself with anger. And so she rushes over to her sister's house where Parmetella has retrieved the magical instruments. And she sees that Parmetella has killed her sister by pushing her in the oven. And she's so upset that she turns herself into a ram and she batters herself to death. Okay. And then by this time, Thunder and Lightning has been disenchanted, so he's white, and they get married. Okay, so I just want to hold these two tales to the side for a moment. I'm going to tell the story of the three citrons, and then I think we'll be right at time. And then on Monday, I'll unpack them, and we'll really get into the historical, linguistic, cultural, and fairy tale context for them, so that you can really see how these racial logics are operating through these stories. Okay, so again, remember, this is a collection of 50 stories, 5 days, 10 stories a day. The three citrons is the penultimate story of the collection. The 50th story is the close to the frame tale. So in some ways, it's the final story. And it is what creates the opportunity for Zosa to tell her story as that 50th tale. So this, the three citrons begins with a prince who isn't interested in getting married because he's never seen a woman who strikes his fancy. And his parents really wanted to get married, but no luck. So one day he cuts his finger and some blood drips on the ricotta cheese. They're in Italy, remember? And he decides then that he will only marry a woman whose complexion combines the red of the blood and the white of the ricotta. So he sets off out into the big wide world to find this woman. And he goes through many trials and tribulations, and eventually he meets an old woman who gives him 3 citrons. And, you know, like the fruit. And the woman tells him, cut open the citron. And when you cut it, go to this fountain that's right outside your kingdom. And when you get there, cut open the first citron and a beautiful fairy is going to come out. But you need to give her a drink of water right away or she's going to disappear. Okay. So he does this, he cuts open the citron, this beautiful fairy, like red as blood, white as ricotta, pops out, but he's too slow and she disappears. So he takes the second citron, he cuts it open, out pops another fairy, but he blows it. So finally, like the third citron, he opens it and he gets the drink of water to the beautiful fairy in time, and they fall immediately in love, of course, and he's gonna take her to his kingdom and introduce her to his parents, but she's just been born of a citron. It doesn't say exactly what she's wearing, but clearly she's not wearing clothes befitting to go meet the king and queen. So he says, just wait here. I'm going to go get you some royal clothes and a carriage so that we can make a kind of proper entry. So she's waiting in this tree. And this is the setup for the part of the story that I really want to talk about, which I am calling Georgia's story. And this part of the story features a slave girl named Georgia. So in this case, she actually has a name. And it echoes the slave story from the frame tale. And both stories begin with in the meantime. You remember when I showed that part about the slave girl stealing the prince by filling the jug? It was in the meantime. So here too, George's story begins with in the meantime. And I think that phrase is important because it shows that these are interludes to the real story of the white protagonist, whose love is being thwarted by these Black false brides. So again, I'm going to be really quick. I'm running out of time. Like the frame tale, this Georgia's story takes place at a fountain where she's been sent to fetch water. And she doesn't realize that the fairy is in the tree above the fountain. And as she's getting water, she mistakes the fairy's reflection in the fountain for her own. And she herself is keenly aware of the color-coded logic of slavery. So she begins to question her status. What you see, unfortunate Lucia, you be so beautiful, and mistress sends you to get water, and me put up with this. Oh, unfortunate Lucia. So here, again, an example of that Moorish patois, and you'll also know that she's referring to herself as Lucia, not Georgia. And I'll just say quickly, Lucia was a generic name for a slave. So she's like, screw this. She breaks the jug and she goes home empty-handed. And the mistress is really mad. So the next day she goes and she's going to get the water. And again, she sees the fairy's reflection and she thinks it's her own. And again, some of the racist language, just so you can understand. Me no thick-lipped slave, me no owl lover, me no wiggle ass. Me so beautiful and me bring barrel to fountain. So again, she breaks the barrel and she goes home and the mistress is really mad and she gives her a savage beating. And so fearing Another beating, Georgia goes to the fountain a third time, where again, she sees her reflection and refuses her status as a slave. Me be stupid to get water, better if Georgia marry. This is where we learn her real name. This no beauty for to die angry and serve cross mistress. So this time she has a goatskin bag that she's going to collect the water in, and she uses a hairpin to poke a bunch of holes in it so the water is all coming out. And this makes the fairy laugh. And all of a sudden, Georgia realizes the source of her underlying beatings, right? That she's not really, that it's actually the fairy's reflection that she's been seeing. So the fairy tells her story to Georgia, and Georgia tricks her into thinking that she's going to help her. She said, let me come up there and comb your hair and make you really pretty for when the prince returns. So she goes up there and she sticks the hairpin in the fairy's head, and the fairy turns into a dove and flies off. And then the prince returns to get her, and there's Georgia, right? And he unleashes this torrent of horrible racialized metaphors. Who put this ink blot on the royal paper where I plan to write my happiest days? Who draped with black mourning the freshly whitewashed house where I thought I would take all my pleasures? Who would have me find this touchstone where I left a silver mine destined to make me rich and blissful? But at this, Georgia, she's quite clever. She says, not to marvel, my prince, for presto, me be enchanted. 1 year white face, 1 year black ass. And I just want to point out as an aside that blackness as an accursed state is so familiar by the time that Basile is writing this collection that it's not surprising to have an uneducated slave girl familiar with that trope, right? So that's one of the things we see here. So despite Georgia's patois and looks and everything, and the fact that the prince is swollen with rage, he takes her back, and the king and queen bestow their crowns upon them, and they're going to have a royal wedding. So the cooks are preparing this celebratory feast, and a dove appears in the kitchen and says, cook in the kitchen, what is the king doing with the Saracen? So historically, Saracens weren't all black, but in this collection, they're always connected with blackness. And then the dove does this for 3 more times, which ultimately leads to the discovery of what has happened and the rebirth of the fairy again through the citron and the false bride's exposure and punishment. And basically, she's punished by the king saying, let me tell you a story. What would you do to a person who treated the fairy like this? And she says what she would do, and then that's what they do to her. So as you can see, this returns us to Zosa's story. There are these tight parallels with it. And upon hearing the story, Tadeo, the prince, is, invites Zosa to share her story. And as she's doing so, the wife, the slave wife, is becoming more and more uncomfortable and trying to get her not to tell the story, but she does. And then Tadeo orders Lucia, who's now named for the first time, to be buried alive, quote, with only her head above ground so that her death would be more tortured. And then he and Zosa are married, okay? So we see these very tight parallels, first between the two Cupid and Psyche / Beauty and the Beast stories, and the frame tale and this penultimate tale. They both turn on the actions of slaves, whether they're the handsome slaves in the first 2 stories or these conniving slave girls. And we'll unpack all of this on Monday. Great, thank you so much. I'm sorry I went a couple minutes over. I should turn off the Zoom now.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, are you some questions?
Yes, I just don't want people to, if you have to go, please feel free to go. I took us right up to 12.
But yeah, maybe you're gonna get into this, but I guess I'm a little surprised that there were very many blacks in these European cultures. I would have pictured them as exotic foreigners.
I will talk about that and the transition in slavery from a system of kind of the spoils of war to a systematic system of human bondage, and the ways that was racialized and what kinds of racial difference there was in and around Naples at that time. So I'll talk about that on Monday. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question though.
I the question. This last story was intended for children?
Yeah, this whole collection is, and it is, that's why I say it's tongue in cheek, the subtitle, Entertainment for the Little One. Yeah, but children certainly listen to this. And of course, in the early 17th century, there wasn't such a sharp dividing line between adults and children, and we didn't have an understanding of children as needing to be protected or anything like that. They basically were like miniature adults. Yeah. But, yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the word Lucia, because where I'm from, it means light.
Yes, and
Not in this story.
yes, and not in the time period too. So there have been people who have looked at this collection and looked and tried to think about Saint Lucia and the way that, as I mentioned earlier, Basile was really playing with a lot of inversions, and that could be one example of the kind of inversion of Lucia as light and as Saint Lucia. But Lucia, we know from historical records, was a very common generic name for a female slave. Yeah, so I think that's why she's called that there. Yeah. And I promise I'll unpack all of this and provide all that context on Monday. I did want to ask, are you interested in reading some of the tales that I'm going to be talking about? And if so, how should I distribute those? Through Barry. Okay, I'll work with Barry. Yeah.
That book, not complete, but a lot of translated stories are, at least on the iBookstore, free.
Okay, great. Yes, and I will provide the padlock, the golden trunk, and the three citrons in the collection of tales that I'll circulate for what else to read. Yes, Doug.
So, everyone, as it happens, there is a fairy tale wedding cocktails announced here at the London Nelson. It may have already happened, but you can see all the information on one of the displays that you can walk out. So, there you go.
Yes, thank you. So I'll see all of you next week. Thank you so much.